And we're live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from, viewing this from, in whatever format you're viewing it. Uh, we're very excited to kick off the very first episode of the Data Commons podcast. And with us, we have the two co hosts of the series, Andrew Padilla and Jessica Talisman. Perhaps we can start by doing some self introductions and we can start to introduce the series. Andrew Padilla, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Hey, Joaquin, Jessica. My name is Andrew Padilla. I am the proprietor of Data Secchia LLC. My background is actually in software engineering. I came into open data several years ago during one of my engagements, and I've been hooked ever since about the the commons in general. Given that my background is in software engineering, I've always been somewhat glued to the open source ethos, and now data. And I, I suppose you can say that my goal is to find a union of the two. Um, that's where I sit.
Thank you, Andrew. Jessica?
Hi, folks. My name's Jessica Talisman, and thanks, Andrew and Joaquin. I am a senior information architect right now at Adobe. Um, I'm working to build a pretty large ecosystem, information ecosystem that aligns with the outside world for the discovery of documentation, learning content, a number of different use cases across Adobe. I come from a background of library and information science. I have a master's in library and information science and a master's in teaching. I've been working in this field since 1997 and have worked with almost everything at a professional level except for health data. To give you an idea, I completely and always leverage the commons or data commons when I'm modeling and building information systems, mostly because of a base ontological value. I think I would call it a value that you have open world assumptions and closed world assumptions. And the open world assumptions are how we relate to, align, and connect to our outside world from within our closed domain spaces. So that's the lens that I typically practice with, and realizing that we have to ground whatever we're modeling, whatever we're building from an information, data, and knowledge perspective in truth. So,
Thank you, Jessica. I'll just do a very brief introduction on myself. Over the last past year, I've been opening up, or developing events and creating a small community gravity centers where people can come together to share knowledge and learn from each other. I wholly believe that the only way we're gonna pave a way for responsible adoption of AI technologies is by having candid conversations and being able to put all of our cards on the table. If we can't talk about it, we can't be about it. So, um, I would like to maybe toss it back to Andrew. Andrew, there's a very, very rich story that you like to tell behind the story of your company name, and perhaps we could share with the audience.
Sure. So data secchia is kind of a mashup between data and acequia. And so what a acequia is in Spanish is it's a essentially an irrigation ditch that was used in New Mexico, where I live, um, to irrigate arid lands. And so the interesting about that, as it intersects with what we're talking about today, is that acequias were arguably one of the first commons in the Americas. And their purpose was essentially to allow folks to survive and, dare I say, in some cases, thrive in an arid environment. But the acequias themselves, or those irrigation ditches, although they span across people's properties and in common areas, they aren't owned by anybody, and everybody agrees to that. So everybody pitches in to clean them, maintain them. In the data world, we'd say curation. But acequias have been, they're here in New Mexico to this day, and they've been here for quite a while. And so I thought it was appropriate to kind of pay homage to the acequias in the context of data and knowledge. So that's my story.
Very quick follow-up question to that story. What would have happened if people didn't join together and assume responsibility for that common property?
So took ownership of it. It wouldn't have worked, simply put. I mean,
They
it,
they
it requires a network that spans across properties. So when you have one ownership of a given section, how do you manage that, in a larger scope? People don't share. It's a walled garden of sorts that we talk about. So it just simply wouldn't work. There are certain baseline common things, I believe, that you have to establish in any society in order to have a fruitful society. And I think the commons of any type is important. And I think that's well underscored today. Of course, we can get into that, but yeah, those are my thoughts on that, and hopefully we'll have some great conversations in the future with folks who believe the same thing.
Thank you, Andrew. Jessica, you had some thoughts that you wanted to share around the terminology data commons.
Sure. There's a repository or platform, and I think that this is important to distinguish, is while the data commons is used and has been used for years amongst practitioners, especially those of modeling information and knowledge. We see examples of what we call the data commons in things like Wikipedia and how Wikipedia is structured and managed using ontologies, for example. That's a very welcome example. But it just so happens that Google has a platform that they also call Data Commons. It's datacommons.org. And even though, the great thing is that within that platform, Google surfaces a bunch of these open data sources. And they've brought them together into an ontology-rich ecosystem to make statistical data like Department of Labor data, a lot of the government data, census data, EU data, lives in data commons and is something that can be used by anyone. And that is the true spirit of data commons. The world of data commons extends beyond Google's data commons platform. And it just so happens to take on the same name.
Thank you for that. There's a mighty powerful influence money can buy when you can brand and do whatever you want whenever you want it. But I appreciate you disambiguating that it's beyond a branded initiative. Yeah, I think one thing that we wanted to cover in this particular series is the idea that no private, public, or government entity is responsible for this or should be responsible for this. If it affects you, I mean, we are all global citizens, different uh, problem sets and solution sets are shared. It affects everybody. So we are all equally responsible to take control and responsibility for paving the digital world and physical world that we want to live in. So I hope we can shed some light into some of the tectonic plates that are moving around, uh, especially nowadays with current events. But I'm sure we're going to get into some flavor of that soon. Um, yeah, I mean, Jessica, you've been sharing resources on the funding, initiatives and the funding cuts, right? Andrea, also you explore this in your professional day-to-day work that you have to place bids on taking on particular projects, but some of those projects are funded by public entities, right?
Correct. Yeah, and just to be clear, largely the fiscal responsibility of putting open data out there is by and large by institutions and federal state agencies. It's not often that you're going to find a private entity that's offering open data. So they really bear the burden of serving the data.
Unless they can monetize it. So an example of that would be like Google product taxonomy might be considered open data in some form or fashion. Same with and that's what's really interesting is the few people that have decided to monetize in some form or fashion. And it's not because they purchase Google product taxonomy. Anyone can download that. But there's value for companies using certain arbitrage techniques to where they can capitalize off of the use of common language. That's just a different lens, although the open data sources that are managed holistically and collaboratively exist separate from those. There's some interesting models.
Yes, so definitely, I think that covers the spectrum of.
So
Go ahead.
for public entities and public institutions, sometimes they're funded by government entities, sometimes they're funded by private parties. Irrespective of their funding, what happens if these public entities that produce the data go away?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I think we are seeing some echo of that now, and that's not putting a political lens. That's just stating a reality. So we will see how that unfolds. My positive stance on this is sometimes it takes something of a crisis for us to realize the importance of something. So in this case, what do we do about serving the open data that is important to society and to the people who use it? When it's taken away, we start thinking about, well, how can we make it such that it's resilient to the hands that serve the information? So in a lot of ways, I think it's a good thing. I know that right now that we're dealing with a lot of pain points regarding its absence. In some cases, you're hearing, and Jessica can talk a little bit about this. Some of the sites have been going down, but this could be a necessary wake up call for us to restructure how we offer the commons in terms of knowledge that's out there. So.
So just parlaying off of what Andrew just touched on, there's some interesting projects as sites or data availability has shifted or changed, meaning that certain open data sources have been cut off or are not available. And in so doing, librarians, not to toot the librarians again, but there have been massive efforts, officially it's called datarescue.org, projects to save and archive these data sets that are no longer publicly available. And so those projects happening at scale, another institution where you see the commons being archived and made available is the Internet Archive, which was founded as a response, for example, to 9/11. As stories and news cycles are as fast as they are today, the headline can change or shift that accounts for the truth or reality of an event. And so Internet Archive was founded on the heels of that, realizing that there was a need to document these news cycles and the actual news being delivered in order to trace truth, to be able to codify knowledge and all of its different manifestations within the cycle, for example, the news, or as quickly as information moves through the internet. Those are the types of more sophisticated actions that are happening in order to be able to surface those as open data endpoints like the Internet Archive. But these other projects that are working to rescue data that has been made unavailable, what'll be interesting to watch is what shape, form, and what availability those data sources or data archives will take. And will we be able to continue to enrich those data sets in some shape, form, or fashion? Speaking to like the true nature of the commons, we would want to continue curating and refining those data structures while adding more rich, so that those data sources need to, in some form or fashion, be kept current. And that I think is still to be determined how that's going to happen, unless you know something I don't, Andrew.
I don't. Well, I have some ideas and aspirations regarding that, but that's currently not a reality. But yes, I agree. Um, One of the other interesting things I might add about some of the things I've read about the scraping of public institution sites and government sites, and I think we'll probably end up talking a lot about this, is that yes, they are scraping the data. But what they're not able to do for whatever reason is scrape the context around it or the metadata data. So when folks go to these sites, often it's devoid or has very little metadata. So that's almost the most important part about it. If you think
Mm.
about observations for time series data, they're just numbers, they're measurements. What do they mean? Who measured them? You know, what are the other things that you could use to describe them? Those are the most important things to people. I was at a workshop earlier this week with a group of users, and we created a word cloud. And one of the biggest kind of the largest fonts there as word clouds go was about trust and metadata. So trust, metadata, lineage, all this relates to describing the data sets we have. So when we talk about the data commons, it's not just measurements or recordings of whatever it is. It's about the description of the context. All of that is important. And so now with these scrape sites, it also brings light to the fact that we're not getting all the necessary data, i.e. the metadata, that we may need. So how do we do that? How do we take all of it together? And then if you also spread that out a little bit more, what produced the information? That goes into kind of my background and how I got into it, the software development world. Those are software is largely the biggest producers of data. It's not usually handwritten down by a person. It's usually through some system. And so how do we include the commons to kind of envelope both the software side of the production of the information and correlate that with the data it produces? So bounded by metadata to provide the knowledge that we need to move forward.
That's a
Um,
great point, Andrew. Like that's the key and what's often missed, is the metadata elements. A lot of people will call it stitching and propose solutions to that to be able to create that holistic view. But it is really hard to gather the metadata. It's almost like two different types of scrapes in order to render, that you would have to somehow stitch together, and it's not very reliable.
I
that's
think
it.
that's I think that's something that gets lost. I certainly, as you are both talking and playing tennis with these ideas, I have a lot of open questions, right? I mean, data is in itself a simple word, but it's not just data, it's metadata, it's where is it stored, what the context is, the actors involved in producing it and everything else that you guys have stated so far. How do we capture the integrity of it if we are porting it over and scanning it, scraping it, trying to preserve it, but we're missing all these bits? How do we talk about data quality in the data commons?
Yeah, good question. And certainly there are data quality issues as it stands with the original institutional governmental sites, not even talking about scraping. You know, it's unfortunate to say, but because there's not a lot of funding that goes towards open data. So oftentimes it's like CSV is the most common format you may find in many open data sites, which has very little metadata, column headers. But there may be a description file, there may be a metadata file. So even if you take away the current state of scraping of sites as they stood originally, there's still a lot to be improved upon in terms of having accurate context, the extra metadata. But I'm actually, very optimistic that these scenarios that we have that are presenting themselves will help all of us collectively think about how do we do it better.
And one thing to note is like data, I just had to look at the website to make sure it's still up, but resources.data.gov, which is the home for Project Open Data. So Project Open Data started from a presidential order in the early 2000s. And it was a data quality and open data resource. And the initiative, which has been signed by almost every president, has been to fund and to create this data commons that's available and open to the public. Right now, I see the site, it uses DCAT, so it uses an ontology. So there is that ontology element there. I see the site still up, but knowing that some of the data sets may be missing, or that it would take further investigation. I do want to say that, having worked in the federal government before, and within those ecosystems, it is, that there is internally a priority. To your point, Andrew, it's not well funded. But it is an initiative that has continued for more than 20 years. So that's hopeful for whatever that's worth.
Totally agree. Yep.
So apart from gathering this data, how is it used? Some key examples that we captured and shared in the description of the Data Commons podcast was global population, statistical data collected on how people live, their diets, and disease, things that are common in certain areas, as well as the use of natural resources like Andrew's physical example of the water commons, right? But what are other functions that you've seen it being employed in?
Yeah, I can give examples of how I've heard it being used, but another interesting observation, I think, about open data, and something that I've struggled with working with teams that publish open data, is that it you're dealing with a user that is largely unknown. You don't know them. Unlike enterprise, where I came from, when you have a user for a product, you come to know them. You come to know what their needs are, what they want to do, and then you use that to develop a product. I'm not saying that's absent in open data communities. In fact, it can be present with large initiatives, and it is. But largely, the users are kind of unknown. It can span, like, for instance, in water data that I focus on, it can span anything from, institutions using each other's data, for instance, for water management, or it could be just a kayaker that wants to know the water levels of a certain stream on a given morning. I mean, so it's really a spectrum, and it could be anything in between.
There's, like, to add to that, you see it used in incident management and emergency incident management. There's a fabulous use case that is relatively old given the speed of tech, where they were able to leverage open data for the response to the Nepal earthquake of 2014. And that was based off of maps and available. They had the University of California, Irvine had gotten funding to model basically Kathmandu and all where Red Cross was, where are the hospitals, where are the schools, where are the libraries, where are all of the community resources, and be able to create a map that could be accessed offline. And it was at the point when they were looking to get absolute funding for this project to launch it live. They had their demo or their POC all figured out. This massive earthquake happened, and the entire infrastructure was taken offline. Thankfully, they had modeled the sort of open data world of where all of these resources and services were. So they were able to address and respond to the emergency in a timely fashion. And that's a pretty, and because geographic data, geodata, and schemas are so rich and strong. In a way, I would say it's complex, but in other ways, it's pretty tidy. And so infusing that sort of geographic data, or being able to link it to open data sources, such as the location of schools, these actual existence of these different services and emergency management protocols. It's amazing to see what can happen on that end of the spectrum if dealing with major emergencies. And I don't want to keep on talking, but there's an immediate thing that is happening in my area. One of the largest battery plants, lithium battery plants that stores solar power. Just to give you context, I live in Santa Cruz, California. So 20 miles from me exists one of the largest battery power grids in the world. And that there's a fire that's still burning of all of these batteries. And there's a lot of concern and response because of not only wildlife, but you have people's homes and kids and schools and what have you. Thankfully, we're surrounded by a number of large universities and resources. And using, again, open data, they were able to graph and track and respond to this emergency with real-time data that was not accessible otherwise through normal agencies. So I really see a strong use for this sort of emergency management case, which is pretty adjacent to environmental open data cases. They kind of touch each other in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Looking at oh, pardon me.
I was
Please
just
go
going
ahead.
to just add to the location-based
Yeah, yeah,
aspect of it. In my work, I find that location is like the primary entry point to data discovery for many open data sets, because most people are interested in data where they live, where they are. So it's
mhm,
the perfect place to as an entry point to discovery. Not to mention that the relevance of the data is highly tied to the location in many
yeah.
open data sets. Yeah.
And that's the beauty, to back to your point, Andrew, of the missing metadata. You can't calibrate your compass and choose like the point of reference or view of which you want to view your data unless you have the accompanying metadata that allows you to do so.
Mhm.
And so that's like really the importance of having those complete and enriched data sets, not fractions or portions of.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask and build on that idea. Um, we've had discussions on the importance of community, the importance of shared resources, shared responsibility. Even in the example of the battery fire incident, there is a requirement for citizens in the local area to assess the damages or environmental impact of something like that in the environment, water supplies, soil samples.
Yep.
So open data and data commons tied to geographic specific situations, occurrences, events leads to open science initiatives.
Yes. Yes. And that's like amazing. The citizen science world is a really powerful playground and use case. Um, one thing is during COVID, we relied upon citizen science quite a bit for, having to connect the different data sources to measure and to record these things in an available resource and tie them back to already existing data sets. We saw that, I think the Atlantic, and which used the Atlantic graph of cases per locale, for example, of COVID cases per locale, which became then was adopted by the New York Times. That was completely based on citizen science and open data. Those dashboards that told us what the hotspots were and what the case counts were per state or city came from citizen science. In fact, so much so, NIH to a certain extent a good portion of NIH that's exposed to the interweb is open data. Like they expose and allow you to download their taxonomy and their ontology. It's not perfect, but it's there, and there's some available open data sources. And so it was interesting to see that paradigm shift in that realm of citizen science, because all of a sudden you had to have a cooperative relationship between these institutions and the citizen scientists out in the world or the ether that were helping to collect and found these data sets to connect them back to the greater commons. And I was about to go into open refine for that matter.
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, so I've talked about this in a talk in I think one of my podcasts or talks before, and I leverage a tool called Open Refine. And for those of you that haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend it. It's a web application. You can bolster it with memory if you put it on a backend, for example, and there are all of these extensions and recipes for building extensions. Open Refine originally started as Google Refine, and I think it was set free into the universe, into the data commons space by Google in 2012, somewhere in there for 12 or 14. And apologies if I get it wrong. And from that point forward, it started getting funded and a lot of participation because it's a great tool for open data in the data commons. It's a free open source tool. There's 8 clustering algorithms helping you to analyze. There's an RDF plugin. You can connect with schemas, and what's even more powerful as this has matured, right before the pandemic started again, which I feel like is a big marker in the open data space in terms of growth and understanding of the data commons. Chan Zuckerberg funded it. She funded it quite a bit because it was being leveraged and used quite a bit for the COVID response and COVID open data sets. So with Chan Zuckerberg Foundation funding, they were able to excel growth and development of the platform and extend the platform, upgrade it through several different versions and make it more available and faster and all those good things. Now, as it stands today, there are, more than 20 knowledge graphs that out of the box, I can connect my data set in Open Refine with those knowledge graphs, and then I can resolve the entities by linking my concepts within or my data points. I can resolve them and link them to actual nodes in open data set graphs. And that's really powerful. That's the power of open data, that we can anchor our data within a common understanding of information and knowledge. Ultimately, it's about communities of practitioners and users agreeing upon the meaning and definition of something. That's the beauty of the data commons, is you have these agreed upon understanding and definition of what this information or knowledge is.
And that's the basis of communication, collaboration, and understanding. So it's a powerful concept, and any tools that further that end are highly valued. I would like to add that some of the things that I notice as it relates to open data is that you can have one publisher of a data set that is marginally valuable. It could be valuable to a person, but the value, the beauty of it is that people have free access to a number of data sets that they can relate and that they could work on. And as has often been said in many data conferences, is that that a single data set is not valuable by itself, but it's often very valuable when you start cross-referencing it with other data sets. And that's where you get the power, whether you work in an enterprise or you're working for a NGO or you're just a community member. Once you start correlating those data sets, that's where the power comes in, the understanding of what is being published out there. And I
And
think
you're able to resolve entities and manage entities at scale.
very much
That's
so.
a really powerful aspect, for sure.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
So I have a question. I actually I would like to decouple a couple of things, but let me start by saying an assertion, and I want you guys to approve or disprove or modify as you see fit. Um, Storing, curating, and distributing free open data is expensive.
It's no more, you just want confirm or deny?
Confirm, deny it, or modify.
Modify.
Confirm.
So what about it is expensive, and what needs to be modified in that statement?
Um, I have a unfinished article that I'm intending to publish myself about the data publisher's burden. This is my own perspective, but it for me, what I've noticed is it's not just about publishing and putting it out there, but there's a whole life cycle to that publication, in much the same way that you hear about open source developers being drained by the community. So there's a certain responsibility that you bear. In the case of open data, there's not yet some kind of architectural commons that allows you to publish without paying for it. So somebody has to pay for it. And in fact, the more popular a data set becomes, the more expensive it becomes for the publisher because of the infrastructure costs. So in that sense, I do think that, yes, it can become expensive. And we need to do something about that. We need to be able to share data where the responsibilities may be pushed out to those who use it the most. We're not there yet, but I think we could be.
And maybe that's like my view, my take on it is I'm approaching it from another direction is I would modify it because there's methods to still leverage open data, and not, for example, linked data. Linked data is an example. So I can access and resolve an entity and include an HTTP identifier that's rich with ontologies in order to validate a concept or an idea or a data point against the data commons. So that would be an example of where me as the practitioner, I'm not incurring cost. The spaces that the open data sources are like VIAF, which is a virtual identity validation framework. That's not what it stands for. The acronym I don't know off. It's a virtual authority file, where that system is meant to identify corporations, subjects, keywords, like a bunch of different sort of data points from around the world, and it's based in library science in the library field. And leveraged by other companies like Amazon and Google. They all use that VIAF.org identifier methodology for resolving entities, so entity management and resolution. So that would be an instance where you're not consuming or requesting the entire data set, but it's these sort of one-off validation matrices where you build it yourself and you're simply looking to manage, expand concepts, or enrich your data to validate the existence of a data point or a thing.
I want to be able to gain more appreciation for what we're sharing here. Maybe we can unpack some of this terminology for my own selfish purposes so that I can get on the same page and make sure I'm in alignment. When we refer to the data commons, we refer to data sets that have metadata, so context or data about data in the context of where it's created, hosted, and shared. We also make mention of some tools and initiatives that are available through the World Wide Web Consortium and other international institutions that are funded and champion standards, right, for open data initiatives and things like that. Offshoots of those things are taxonomies, which are classification systems, hierarchical classification systems, ontologies, human and machine interoperable blueprints of how the world exists, and knowledge graphs, which are composites of potentially taxonomies, ontologies, and data sets. So what claims are we making with the data in the context of these other open initiatives? And if somebody would like to create their own data set to have as a data commons or would like to contribute to a data commons, how can they engage these concepts together? I know that's a big question.
A very loaded question.
Sorry.
Okay, can you repeat? It's two parts. So one is like all the different things exist, and then yes.
Yeah, first let's disambiguate these terms and the relationships between terms, and then we'll go into the next compound question afterwards. Sorry about that.
No worries. I mean, we're defining taxonomy, ontology, knowledge graph, all that
And
jazz.
then the data commons data sets themselves and how they play together.
So a taxonomy, I'll go with taxonomy first, is a hierarchy that represents parent-child relationships. And it usually correlates or represents the description of you can think of it as a commons or a space or a domain space, for example. And so that's taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is usually supported and structured or encoded using an upper ontology to define the hierarchy. So only then is it valuable to a machine.
I think the dog really wanted to add on to the taxonomy definition. That's what it is, right?
Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're still audible if you want to finish the. You were audible the whole way. It's not distracting at all.
Ontology. Should we move on to ontology? Andrew, do you want to grab?
Keep rolling, Jessica. This is your
yeah. All right. So ontology is, you can think of it as a schema at base. An ontology describes the relationships and the context of terminology or data points. So you usually have, very simplistically, you have classes, properties, attributes, and relations. A relation, what you will see often is most people think, oh, an ontology is just declaring the parent child. Maybe you see it in very simple primitive JSON. That's how most people correlate or relate to it. But in fact, ontologies take it a step further in its descriptive nature. So a relationship, I often help people understand relationships beyond type or has a. Not to get into the weeds, but that usually is more supportive of a thesaurus type view. You want to describe what type of relationship, because the whole name of the game with ontologies is disambiguating and descriptive context. So for example, when we describe relationships between concepts, and the reason why we have ontologies is so that we can break out of relational database type views or representations. It removes the constraints that SQL tables or Postgres tables present, in that you can have dynamic, very dimensional model of the world, your data, information, knowledge. So a relationship, back to the relationship, it would be has version, right? Instead of type version. Well, that's completely valid. If you're going to scale with an data information knowledge system, it's important in everyone's best interest that those relationships are defined and described as explicitly as possible. So that's ontology.
Knowledge graph being the composite of data and ontologies and or taxonomies, right?
So you need to have, and it's interesting because a lot of folks do not model taxonomies explicitly. They jump right into ontology, only to find out down the line that there's data quality issues. I will tell you very transparently that I model taxonomies, controlled vocabularies first, then taxonomies, that iterative approach, because it enforces data quality parameters for what you're doing. Very, very important. You can dedupe or remove any potential clashes that get those issues become more complex and more difficult to detect once you add ontologies. The other important thing is just the simple exercise of structuring a taxonomy helps you declare the rules, the inference, the direct, the indirect type of relationships that concepts can have. It helps to form the logic of your ontology, because the most important thing is ontologies are logical models, and we tend to lose sight of that. So yes, there are rule bases and there's logic baked in that declares that certain relationships can happen and certain relationships cannot, for example. Those have to be formed and declared as part of your ontology. I think one more important thing to note is that an ontology, if you choose to use an ontology and it's an out-of-the-box open source, like meaning open data ontology, you don't have to use every single thing in that ontology. It's okay to use different elements from different ontologies that best suit your use case. Most ontologies, not all, but you can find so many ontologies online that are W3C published and available. Speaking of W3C, like that's another example of open data or the data commons. So through and through, it becomes like a very collaborative effort, and you're able to enrich your data with context and meaning.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
I would
Oh,
like
sorry.
to add a future state of data commons without knowledge graphs being a big part of that. The stitching of all the data sets that are out there, I think, is an unrealistic expectation that if this future data common state is to be viable, resilient, it very much involves knowledge graphs. Um, that's not to say that you won't find many portals that just have CSVs and little context, but a mature state of the data commons will be, um, not without a heavy dose of knowledge graph technology in there, for sure.
If I may selfishly try to integrate more of this knowledge into my own brain schema, it totally makes sense to be able to start with a taxonomy being a highly structured, it's either this or that kind of way of decomposing the world, and a controlled vocabulary being, here are the terms that are important to this particular domain, water levels. I don't know what are other specific words that apply to water commons, Andrew.
I mean, there's so many. um,
But
yeah.
could you give
So,
us some very niche examples of like very specific terminology that deals with water commons?
um, mostly so there's a certain vocabulary out there. It's probably not well known, but it's called ODM, and there's quite a few terminologies that are there related to things like types of analytes that they would measure for in water, those sorts of things. Units become a very big part, well, although it's not specific to water, because much of the things about water data are about measurements. So there's an ontology that describes units very well. There's one called QUDT. So that's one that's used at least in the sphere that I work in. But yeah, there's quite a few. What one of the I think one of the biggest um, issues that I see is that folks from different groups or talk about the same concepts, but in slightly different ways. And
Mm.
that's where things like vocabulary, control vocabularies and the like can unify different groups of people and align them before they start talking about building out anything, really. It's the basis. I really like Jessica's approach, her, what was it called, Jessica? The ontology
Ontology.
pipeline. Yes. Perfect.
Yes.
Yes. And I do think that needs to be, articulated more to people in open data, or even people in the enterprise, really, which is oddly enough in the enterprise, I haven't seen there are folks obviously that are using ontologies, but it's not a common thing. Most people, when they think about managing data, they think about relational databases. And not to say that it doesn't have its purpose, but when you start expanding your scope across systems, across organizational units, that's where increasingly I think, the knowledge graph technology and context and being able to disambiguate terms and those sorts of things, because everybody has their own language. So you get out of a silo into another silo, and folks have different ways of understanding things. So getting a common understanding is like extremely vital to being able to have effective systems. Period.
You
And
can't
that's
have a oh, go ahead, sorry.
no, that was it.
You see a great use case for this in the library space. So starting in 2018, there's a large, more than decade-long linked data project in the library and information science space that was pretty well funded, but you see it done at scale with libraries. They still catalog, but they're the leveraging again of linked data to align vocabularies. I do want to say that, and this is just drawing from Data Day Texas, since that was like a common experience that we had, Andrew. The metagrid, Ul's metagrid, which was the keynote speech. As I came back to work and after Data Day Texas and started tackling some of the issues or problems that I'm solving at Adobe, it started making sense in that the idea of aligning and resolving entities, and allowing for autonomy. It's never realistic that we're all going to adopt the same vocabulary. That's the truth. And there is that reality within institutions and within enterprises. So how do we handle that? And this is where open data does help, because it's almost like the Switzerland or the neutral party, the outside force that is asking us to gather around as a community to align to these common understandings of what these things are. So I think there's like a higher, more abstract purpose to it, in that when we start to understand the value of that community understanding of what a thing is, or of knowledge, it starts to become a force of its own. And there are different ways that you can resolve your domain specific or internal data with the outside world. That's what's interesting. One of them's linked data. But I'm sure, Andrew, you have a couple of tricks or some things that you've been working on in terms of resolving or aligning vocabularies or terminology with the open data, or integrating them within where I've been in a situation where you have to create some interoperability between several different systems, for example. That's a place where open data comes in handy.
For sure. Yeah, that's my world.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I keep going back to like the contrast between enterprise space and linked data, but I formerly came from a master data management company, and that was the purpose of those products is to basically say that one thing in one system is referring to the same entity as in another system. And in my context, it was healthcare, and it was an essential part to being able to create like this longitudinal record of a patient as it passes through systems. But it was also very hard to implement and just manage. To this day, I believe that's the case, although I've left the space. But I find the same issues in the linked kind of open data world. I'm involved to a certain degree in the NSS Proto-OKN project, but while the problem still exists that we need to be able to span across graphs, the capabilities that are inherent in graphs to say this is the same thing as that is already baked in. It's a very simple predicate. They call it same as. But in other data sets, there's no notion, there's no way to say, okay, I accept that this description of this entity may exist somewhere else. It's not out of the box in those systems. And that's what I find to be most intriguing about representing data in a graph context, specifically RDF, because you can do those things. Like you can enter a situation where after the fact, you can decide to resolve things and kind of take a layered approach rather than starting over. And I think that's what I find the best thing about leveraging knowledge graphs in conjunction with other data sets or as a data set, is that you can enter a situation where you don't know what the relationships are going to be like, but then as you come to understand them, you can model them. So it's a great thing.
I think the biggest takeaway for me, just in this conversation, in the context of data commons, is the importance of starting from very structured and basic, primitive understandings as a means to enable community development to take hold. If you can't communicate in the same common language and start by defining big chunks of reality and slowly start to unravel these things and say, yeah, this concept is defined in this way, and we're going to use it in this different way colloquially. But we respect that this is the means for us to have a federated approach to dealing with this kind of project. that's just a personal preference in our language, great. Whether it's in French, Italian, English, Spanish, the concept remains pure. Um, but then I also see the danger in expressivity in language. Any chain of words can result in drastically different interpretations. Mind you, between two people that live in the same town and city, as well as two people that speak different languages and have different culture. So, I think it's important to find a way to support and address how to mature these initiatives in a way that addresses the cultural and community aspects of it. Because yeah, the technical is something that's feasible. We already have the technology. There are people that are willing, capable, to contribute to this. If it's something that benefits global populations, either people can chip in, governments can chip in, or private institutions could chip in, whatever. But I think that's the hairiest problem of this initiative. How do we bring people together under the same perspective?
Yeah, it's a powerful, I think where we can shed light, and I will say that AI is actually bringing the commons into more focus for people. And I mention that only because it helps to construct the use case in terms of why it's important for us to align on the meaning of data, information, and knowledge, and why those communities are important. Because the reality is that AI is trained on a lot of open data sources, and a lot of those open data sources are available as knowledge graphs. So the definition and common understanding of what these things are start to extend into the models that are being leveraged by many, many enterprises and institutions. So it presents almost, I think, more of a call to action, um, in that, however it's being leveraged, there is a need for more alignment around the meaning and context of things. And I'm trying very hard to stay apolitical.
You're doing a fabulous job.
Thank you.
Andrew, what do you say?
I think that's a great point that Jessica made. My perspective that especially I've been hearing more and more is one of the things that AI has brought to bear, specifically LLMs, is lowering the bar for the average community member to be able to interact with data. I keep hearing that more often, so it's more accessible to people. If you go back, not too long ago, the kind of the call to make things accessible to the community was using APIs, which is interesting at its face because most people don't know how to use APIs. The audience is really programmers, but yet that was for a long time. You want to make things accessible, use APIs. But this is the first time, and that's why it's so compelling, in spite of the challenges, that people can ask questions and have a dialogue of sorts with a machine and iteratively discover new things. That's very compelling. That mode of learning and engaging with data sets in that manner is very compelling. And so, yes, there's challenges with the veracity of the data or the conclusions that say a given model comes up with. But I think it's such a seductive aspect in a way for the average person to have access to the information that's out there in the world that I think it'll continue to evolve. So we have some problems to solve, but being able to interact with data through a machine it's not going away. We're just going to have to solve those issues, and it makes a lot of sense because previously, what were we doing? We're bending the way to interact with the limitations of a machine, and now we're finally approaching to the point. And I think I said this on another podcast where the machine is bending to the way we do things, the way we interact, the way we understand things, and that's the future.
So we're gonna sign off relatively soon. If you stood through this podcast to the end, You are our people, and if you or someone you know is interested in talking about a particular project, data commons initiative, or maybe some of the work that you've had to engage in through your practice, let us know, and we'll put you on the schedule. We'd love to continue to grow this concept community education platform. um, Again, we can't do this by ourselves. You can't do it alone. We have to band together to leverage each other's strengths, and it's a shared responsibility. So, very excited to be a part of this with you both, Andrew and Jessica. Any last words?
Just looking forward to it. Yeah, looking forward to engaging with interesting folks in this space, whether they're have been deeply involved in the open data movement for since its inception. Let's just say it's the 2010 era, to those who are just newly discovering and have some interesting stories to tell. Love to hear about it.
Yeah, and I'm very excited for this just because I think it's an opportunity to expose some of these brilliant folks and very involved and dedicated community members, one of our intentions is to bring them into this commons, if we can call this podcast the commons, and start to kind of co-locate and get a bigger understanding of the level of effort, what's involved, what are the problems in this space, and really dive deep into some of the nuances of the different domain spaces in open data. So it's very, very exciting. I think people who are sort of wrestling with AI implementations and knowledge and information and data structuring and knowledge, or management, will benefit a lot from some of these conversations going forward, to sort of unlock the core, the essence of open data and why it's important and why it's powerful.
Excellent. Well, thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening. We're going to sign off now. So,
Thanks.
Thank you.
you guys